Good. Do it.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Gaston, for the introduction. Welcome, everybody. I'm really excited to be here. First of all, I need to thank the ICF South Florida chapter, and of course, my good friend Gaston and coach and compatriot for this invitation to offer me the time to provide a few insights into coaching and higher education. As Gaston has already mentioned, I focus on leadership and organizational development in higher education. I spent most of my career serving colleges and universities in various capacities, both as faculty and staff roles. And I feel really privileged to have gained some deep insights into the higher education enterprise, which it really is, and also have worked with and learned from some amazing leaders. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, I've also experienced a little bit of the dark side firsthand. Of what is really by and large often a dinosaur of a system, and I'll address this in a second here, and especially as far as leadership and organizational structures are concerned. So let's dive right in. Let's see if this does this. Aha, very good. So here's the agenda. Here's a couple of questions that I'm using to frame my presentation. The first one, what is it that makes colleges and universities different and somewhat unique organizations that are often puzzling to people from the outside, especially for those who come from industry? It's, Gaston and I had this conversation at some point last year, and he asked me to explain higher education to me, and his eyes got bigger and bigger and bigger. So it was really fun to try to explain something very complex to him like this, and it still didn't make a whole lot of sense, I know that. There are also several challenges that are very specific to the higher education enterprise, and we'll use this session to explore them a little bit as well. Then let's talk about coaching. Coaching is not well established in higher education, but it really has the potential, I believe that strongly, to have a much greater impact than most of those development mechanisms that are currently in place. So we'll talk a little bit about why coaching in particular can be a super powerful tool in higher education. Then you'll also see that the challenges in higher ed are somewhat different than in other industries or elsewhere. Even though, of course, there is a lot of overlap with more business-oriented coaching. So I'm going to list a few coaching topics that are very relevant in many institutions. And then finally, I'll summarize a couple of key takeaways and provide some areas where we as coaches in particular can have a real tangible, positive, and sustainable impact on higher education institutions. So let's start with a quick overview, especially for those of you who are not familiar with higher ed. Before I begin, there's a little bit of a caveat. So there are over 4,000 institutions of higher learning in the United States alone. And each one, just like any organization, really is unique. So some serve their very specific student populations extremely well. They're great and really meaningful places to work. Others have smaller or sometimes very larger pockets of dysfunction and toxicity, again, like any organization, and also fail to create a positive student and employee experience. So each of these institutions is different. So what I'm presenting on is somewhat a generalized view of what a typical quote unquote institution would be like that would fall in external advisors and
okay.
address their challenges.
Okay.
Gaston, I think you're not, or somebody's not muted.
Yeah.
All right, perfect. So let's start by saying that you are here. See that little thing? So imagine you're standing right there, and I chose this image, and I actually used AI to create this image, and it actually worked out pretty well. So at first glance, when you're standing there, right, so you see the facade of this wonderful university. It's clean, looks like a real temple of knowledge and innovation, and then you think organizationally, there's some flat hierarchies, then you see students running around living their best lives and growing as future leaders, citizens, change makers. But the facade, when you look behind the facade there, it hides tremendous complexity. So first of all, there's a reason why I put grain silos there, because there are some deeply embedded functional and disciplinary silos, and often I say even silos within silos at most of our institutions. So we have, for example, just to start, we have faculty, we have staff, and then we have the boogeyman, which is the administration. I put that in quotes. And within these groups, you have disciplinary factions. You have people with different ranks, with different functions. And so there's layers upon layers of complexity built in. Unfortunately, also, many of these groups don't talk to each other. There's often kind of a lack of mutual appreciation and understanding between these groups that I sometimes have called castes, like in India. I know this is a very strong word, but in some institutions it really does apply. So I mentioned, we think there are lots of flat hierarchies, very, very innovative. But the reality is oftentimes that they're very strict hierarchies. They're also based on position, on degree, on rank, on title, on academic discipline. So just think about those with PhDs versus those with not PhDs. So we're talking about faculty versus staff, for example. Even within the faculty group, there are tenure track versus non-tenure track people. So folks who just focus on teaching, they're not on a research track to become full professor down the road and maybe something else. And then, of course, you have the professional staff, which that's where my heart really beats, and that's most of my background personally, that are often very much, I don't want to say like ignored or sidelined or just not really considered. So as a result of that, you have a wide range of priorities between each silo and subgroup. Then you also have faculty that in some institutions are very strong and other ones not so strong anymore, governance structures that often pit them against the administrator. So think about an administrator who, wants to make a very unpopular decision, more of a business-oriented decision or strategy that is to be implemented. And then the faculty say, no, this interferes with our teaching and research. You see how they're really not in alignment. And then I mentioned professional staff that are often not considered in organizational decision-making, even though I would say they're the ones who arguably, run the show. So you're wondering, why is that? So one of the reasons is that there is often a lack of a unified and shared vision for the institution, because each of these groups has their own priorities and their own vision of what they're trying to do. Then there are also different success criteria in each of these groups. Think about evaluation, promotion, outcomes, KPIs, if you want to use that term. For faculty, they're very different than for professional staff. Then you look at the administration, they look at it maybe more holistically, more big picture. And then that goes hand in hand with it. There really is no business model that fits higher education. I mean, this is a completely separate discussion for hours. But when you think about it, traditional business models don't fit. And if you just want to look at it, ask a very simple question. And I've asked this question in some of my writing on agile transformation in higher education. What is the product? What is the product of these institutions? You would think it's education. Well, first of all, exactly what does that mean? If you ask a professor, it depends whether they're teaching track, their research track. They might have focused much more on their research. If you ask a staff member, what's the product? They're not thinking about student educational outcomes. They're about the work they do, administrative work, hiring, onboarding, whatever it is that they do. So that's an issue in and of itself. Then, of course, there are major challenges and complexities in funding and funding mechanisms. And then there is, as a result of that, or intertwined with this, the issue of resource scarcity and also very problematic allocation models. And, as the saying goes, where there's little to go around, the fighting gets kind of vicious. There's a lot of competition. And some institutions, depending on how they're led, actually foster and promote this competition. That's problematic in itself. So what's the result of all that? And this is maybe some considerations directly for coaches when you have the opportunity to go into an institution of higher learning. There are organizational structures, reporting lines, decision-making processes, and so forth. They're often completely nonsensical to outsiders. And it takes a lot of just accepting it and just going with the flow to be able to navigate this landscape. And there's another thing, that is that higher education institutions are often extremely slow to respond to and enact meaningful and sustainable change. So think about it. A lot of institutions still engage in creating 10-year strategic plans that may take a year or so to create. 10 years. This day and age, 10 years could as well be 100 years. Think about just how the rise of artificial intelligence over the last, year and a half, 2 years, has completely uprooted a lot of things. So when you have an institution that creates a 10-year strategic plan, you can't possibly anticipate what's going to happen in 10 years, not even 5. So it's really, really tricky. And at the same time, and this is also important to understand, and I hinted at that, there are some really ossified structures, organizational structures, leadership structures that stifle innovation, especially administratively. There's a lot of like, well, this is how we've always done things, and this is how we continue to do things. And this affects a lot of times the people on the front lines, for example, professional administrators or professional staff. But those are the people really where the rubber meets the road. And I think there's a lot of work that could be done in this space as well. So again, just looking at yourself here, looking at this graphic and this picture, I think it gives you a little bit of an idea of where the complexities lie here. So let's talk about some challenges that are more or less unique to higher education. The first one is what I have termed two fallacies. There is a lot of identity involved, and the identity a lot of times is based on rank, title, function, degree, and discipline, which then, as a result, puts leadership or perceived leadership or the claim to leadership in the positionality, on the positionality chair, so to speak. So just because I have a PhD and I am a full professor, I am entitled to maybe a leadership position. Or because I have been in an administrative role at another institution, like a private university, now I'm here at this public college, I am entitled to X, even though they don't really understand what's happening at this one. So that's the first one. And I call this sometimes the faculty leadership trap. Also with faculty, the challenge working with them a lot of times, this is nothing against them, it's just the way, especially tenure track faculty are trained. It is about their dissertation, their PhD, their research, their publications, their conference presentations, their advancement, their tenure promotion, all these things. And if you then have one of those individuals, for example, to become a chair or a director of a department or of a unit or a center, a lot of times they're very ill prepared. They don't know how to lead because their career has largely been about themselves. It's just how it is. Also, because there is a lot of times a lot of competition, there's often also very little psychological safety in some of these environments. So that's one thing that you as a coach always have to consider is how able and willing are they actually to open up, to be open to be receptive to the kind of work and the kind of service that I'm providing. But as a result of this, a lot of times at our institutions, we have very strong top-down command and control structures. So anybody who's been in industry and who's encountered the Peter Principle in action will know that those cultures are often more concerned with maintaining the status quo than innovation. And at the same time, and I've seen this in higher ed a lot, those people then also then decide who actually gets developed and who is worthy of further development. And then it becomes kind of like a self-fulfilling prophecy because ultimately it maintains the status quo. The other one that I put here, organizations equals machines, there's a confluence of two very challenging mindsets. The first one is a very scientific, logical, questioning mindset that, especially by research or tenure track faculty, who look at things very logically, in a very structured way. Many of them embrace a very quantitative mindset. For them, unless maybe they're sociologists or maybe people in the education department, for them, the people aspect, the qualitative aspects don't necessarily matter as much. So relationships are not that important. Structure and process is more important than relationships. But the result there is that many of them perceive organizations in general as machines instead of the complex, adaptive, human-driven social ecosystems that they are. And so there's a huge challenge there. So what's the result here? Well, the result really is that there's an absence of meaningful and sustainable leadership development in many institutions. Not everywhere. Some have fantastic programs. But mostly what we find are one-offs, a lot of times run by HR. There's short-term trainings and workshops, and then there's little to no follow-up. So that's a problem. The other result is also that there's some very outdated concepts of leadership, because leadership, again, is a reflection of positionality and perceived competence. And then those outdated concepts also have a really detrimental effect, and that is the question of who's actually entitled to an opinion, who's entitled to be heard. And that is one thing that I've worked with leaders on, because they think, well, that person can't possibly, they're just an administrator. How can they possibly have anything to contribute? It's like, well, think twice. Let's dig into this, right? So that's another question. The next one is, think about higher ed's traditional core mission. It was teaching and learning, and then research and scholarship. And then a little bit later came this whole idea of service to society. But really what's dominating now is that kind of like that fourth mission, and that is economic development. And in my opinion, a somewhat myopic focus on career preparation for students. There's lots of institutions like, we just need to prepare students for their career, kind of leaving out what an institution of higher learning was originally designed to do. I'm not saying that it can't evolve, but again, you still need to kind of pay tribute to what higher education was originally designed to do. So the result of that is really that there is a conflict with different stakeholder priorities and expectations. So you have students, faculty, administrators, staff, the community at large. And then you also pair that with tremendous financial and funding pressures. Resource scarcity, I mentioned that earlier, is a huge issue. But here's the kicker with resource scarcity. It's always often used as an excuse, quote unquote, or so it's perceived, to not pay people, for example, what they should be worth, or to cut programs here and move the money somewhere there. Because the whole thing is very murky and very complex. There are also some very flawed allocation models that, in my opinion, really stifle response to change in organizational agility. The money isn't necessarily where it needs to be to respond quickly to the changing environment. And then finally, higher ed institutions used to be, and to some extent still are, some great places to work. But employee priorities, especially since COVID, have changed and shifted tremendously. People want more autonomy. They want the opportunity to work from home, find more meaning in their work. They want connection. They want to find some fulfillment, opportunities to learn, to grow, and to advance. And we're also looking at a generational shift. I mean, there's more younger people coming up who are looking for these kind of jobs or interested in this kind of work. They have different priorities. But many institutions just simply cannot, or I guess arguably are unwilling to create such environments. So, and that really, but those environments are needed for people to flourish, and then also to make them want to stay. So as a result of that, increasingly, there's a higher and higher turnover. And people leave either to advance or to seek greener pastures, or because they just can't stand it anymore, or they just want to find more meaning in what they do. So that's a big issue. And then finally, the final challenge is, and I think that's really very relevant to this discussion, is the very siloed image of coaching. And I talked about the silos earlier. You see them there on the right. Because at the lower to mid-level of the institution, coaching is generally viewed as a punitive intervention mechanism for employees in trouble. We're currently dealing with that. I'm running a coaching program at a large research university in the Midwest. And when I talked to the folks in the HR department, I asked them, it's like, okay, with all these clients that are coming in, what are you hearing? It's like, yeah, when we ask them how things are going, they're very quiet. Then we ask them, they think, they're only in this program because they're in trouble. What they don't see is something that the upper administrators have known generally for a long time. That's where coaching is more established and rightfully really seen as a benefit to help with development and retention. But at the lower level, it hasn't been socialized like that. So that's a huge challenge. So this just gives you a little bit of an idea of what we're facing when we're talking about coaching in higher ed. Now, why coaching in higher ed? So we already talked about the identity, position, rank, title, degree, etc., how it really determines people's claim to leadership and also their self-perception of competence. I mean, I have met quite a few people who said, well, I have a PhD. Of course I know. And then when we started working together, they're like, oh, okay, I'm missing a puzzle piece here. Again, it's no fault of their own. It's just that's part of the system. So because of that, directive approaches simply don't work because they undermine employees' identities and question their competence. And anybody, I mean, I'm everything DISC certified. So anybody who knows those strong D types, for example, or DC types, for them, feeling competent is extremely important to their sense of self-worth and identity. And again, when you look at academics and then academic leaders, a lot of them group over there on the the DC side of the circumplex. If you're very interested in that or to take a DISC, just let me know. Happy to run that through with you and do a debrief. But so because of that, again, directive approaches, they're just not going to yield the result. And there's another thing that comes in, which is also their perception of your competence as an external advisor. So that's another thing that we need to factor in. One of the reasons I ended up getting my doctorate is because I wanted to be taken seriously. I know this is terrible, but it has helped down the road. So depending on who you're working with, this may or may not factor in. The other thing, or the other reason why coaching in higher ed, I think, is the right approach is because we have such organizational complexities that really demand a longer-term non-directive approach to leadership and organizational development. And also what we're trying to do is to for our clients to achieve some personal and professional goals that at the same time also align with their units, their colleges, or institutional priorities. So again, there are multiple levels of that we need to consider when we actually even do the discovery and articulate the goals. But coaching really does offer this opportunity for long-term development, as you know, because they're not one-offs. As you know, coaching is not a quick fix. It really is, in the end, and this is an argument I've been making a lot recently, it is a powerful tool to counter turnover. Because it also allows for strategic development, for succession planning. It provides the prospect of advancement, and it really helps develop the next generation of leaders. And it's a lot more sustainable than just doing workshops, even do a weekend or so. Now, there is a caveat here, and I mentioned that earlier, I addressed it. It is absolutely crucial that coaching is a benefit, is socialized as a benefit, as advertised as such, and optimally also included and baked into the overall employment development strategy at a college. If it's not, it's tricky because then you have to make sure that people actually understand what coaching is about and what the benefits are. And finally, coaching is not consulting. So for all of us here who are coaches, you know that. But the reason I'm mentioning this is because consulting has a really bad rap in higher education in particular. And there's a good reason for that. Because traditional consulting approaches generally do not work. Because the complexities and unique challenges of higher education just don't really align. I talked about the business model of higher education, which doesn't really exist. Maybe it's something somebody could do one day. Example, at one of my previous institutions, the university decided to do a compensation study. So they brought in a large, very well-known consulting firm. I back then was on the staff senate, on the budget committee, and I was then invited to be in a smaller committee to actually support these poor consultants. And they said, oh, we're going to, timeline, we're going to be done in just a couple of weeks, and we'll be fine. We're going to review this and review that. So then we didn't hear from them for about 2 weeks. We had a meeting, excuse me, and you could tell that they were completely flustered and flabbergasted. They said, why are there 1,200 different job titles at this institution? And why do many of them only have like one incumbent? And why is there such a big difference between, the faculty and the staff and all these? They just didn't understand it. And we just had to explain a lot of things to them. And then even it didn't make any sense. So their traditional approach and the consulting approach, established consulting approach, just didn't work. And in the end, honestly, the whole thing kind of petered out and didn't really yield much at all. But, coaching, again, is built on clients having, or at least we help them to find the answers, to use their knowledge, to use their understanding of their reality, and ultimately help them create a better future for themselves. Whereas when you think about it, consultants are there, they do an analysis, an assessment, they write a report, and then they say, this is what you need to do. That doesn't align with an organization like a typical institution of higher learning. So that's some of the reasons, or why I think coaching and why you should try to coach in higher ed. You can really have an impact, but coaching is the way to go there. Now, there's a big question, and I briefly hinted at that earlier. That's the question of coachability, especially when you talk about faculty and burgeoning faculty leaders, because there is this self-perceived competence as leaders that that doesn't necessarily meet reality. Also, again, depending on how they went through their career, often there is a great unwillingness to be vulnerable, to find themselves accepting psychological safety as you as a coach can offer. This is a very important thing, and working with some leaders, it's easy. I've worked with leaders who really had a really hard time opening up and allowed themselves to be vulnerable because they weren't used to it. So that's one thing I think that needs to be addressed right at the beginning about coachability. All right, let's talk about a couple of topics. And again, these will sometimes align with what you may have experienced as a business coach. Some are very unique to higher ed. So, for example, just building the knowledge and capacity for what I would call contemporary leadership, which, quoting Aaron Dignan here from Brave New Work and from the consulting from the Ready, he would call this complexity conscious and people positive. So being aware of an organization not as a machine, but as a complex, adaptive, living, breathing organism. And then also people positive. It's more like the McGregor theory X versus theory Y. You want to believe that people want to do the best work, that they want to grow, that they want to thrive, that they want to develop, that they want to contribute and make this a meaningful place. The second one that I have here is driving, creating, and leading change. And knowing the difference. Again, this could be in and of itself another presentation or another discussion. But I always say, really, as institution leaders, we should drive the change, but the change should be created from the bottom up. I've actually written a little bit about that on my blog and invite you to check it out at leadershipimagine.com. And again, you lead change, you drive it, but you see where you create it. This happens at different spots in the organization. And you have to be very strategic and very deliberate about that. So that's another topic that comes up in coaching. Then, of course, there's helping clients, especially those who have come into higher education from the outside, to understand their place and also understand the ambiguities of their role or roles within the higher ed ecosystem. This can be very challenging. If somebody comes from an organization where things are very clear, reporting lines very clear, responsibilities very clear, all of a sudden they find themselves in an institution of higher learning and they may be confused what their role really is, what the expectations are. Then there's, of course, the topic of academic leaders leading staff in particular. There are multiple levels and layers of power differential there. One is oftentimes the issue of degrees. Again, one has a PhD, the other one generally doesn't. So that alone puts some things. Then there are preconceived notions of staff, the way they view faculty, the way they view staff. Many of them are not positive, unfortunately. So there's a big gap in terms of mutual understanding. Then there's the issue of leading groups and teams, and I may not have that in here. And again, knowing the difference between a team and a work group that may work parallel to each other, may be doing the same thing, but there's no interdependencies there. And you may have experienced this. There's nothing worse than, or few things worse than somebody coming in and doing a team development workshop, and we're looking at each other and saying, we don't need that. That's not us. It doesn't reflect the way we work in our reality. Then there's another area here, and that is what I would call the inner game of the leader. I talked a lot about identity and self-perception, but then there's also the sometimes lack or difficulties with being humble, humility, also being comfortable in spaces of not knowing. That is a huge issue in higher ed, especially as higher ed and society and the geopolitical and sociopolitical environment is evolving and constantly changing. Then I have a couple more. One is building innovative capacity amongst various campus communities, and also then building those agile organizational and leadership structures and resilient cultures. That is where my core interest and passion really lies, in that particular area. And I addressed earlier succession and strategic planning, where you want to bring in agility, flexibility, and responsiveness to change, rather than either knee-jerk reactions or just hiding behind a 10-year strategic plan. You say, well, we'll address this when the strategic plan ends in 7 years. Well, it's not going to be a problem anymore. And finally, this has been going on for a long time, but I'm only going to mention this briefly. This is leading through mergers and acquisitions, consolidations, both academic, administrative, and reorganizations. I myself have been the victim of a reorganization that went terribly, terribly wrong, and ultimately actually got me to the point where I resigned, because the structures that had been put in place were just not conducive to me feeling good about myself, about the work I was doing, and why I was doing this work. It was a lot of learning that happened there on my end, and again, reorganizations can be a tremendous opportunity to really bring in the community, but they can also be extremely disruptive and have massive negative consequences. And that unfortunately was the case with the reorg that I lived through. All right, I'm just going to leave those here. Just a couple of takeaways, and then we're pretty much at the end. And then, of course, I want to open this up and give you the opportunity to ask questions if you have any. So keep in mind, higher ed institutions are often very slow to respond to and enact meaningful and sustainable change. So my call to you is help them become more agile and learn to what you could call the activate to and draw on the tremendous potential of knowledge and skills that is embedded in their organizations. Again, they usually run always to the same people for answers. How often has an institutional leader gone to a department and sat down in a lowly staffed member's receptionist's office and said, tell me what's going on here? How are you perceiving some of the things that are going on? Some of the decisions that have been made. What are the students telling you? It doesn't happen. Why? Well, the one is administrator, the other one is professional staff. One may have, an advanced degree and tremendous experience. The other one is just perceived to be just a worker bee. So help them see that there's so much knowledge and innovative potential at those levels. And also remember, those who know how things really are and how best to improve them may be the ones who are very rarely given a voice. Could also be, for example, non-tenure track faculty, adjunct faculty. They're usually not included in any decision making. And then also, see if we can help leaders view and understand their institutions not as machines. But, so machines, as I said, when some of these things doesn't work, you can fix a machine. You can take something out and replace it with something that works. But organizations aren't like that. They're not machines. So help them see organizations complex, adaptive, living organizational ecosystems, I like to call them. And finally, as far as our job as coaches and members of the ICF and our call to promote coaching in different and new areas, let's find a way to dispel the image of coaching as a punitive intervention for employees in trouble, right? It is not just in higher ed, but beyond, of course. So really, that's what I have here for you. I'd like to just close with saying that higher education has tremendous potential, tremendous opportunities for coaches to make a real difference. It's not an easy space to be in and requires at least some, say, fundamental knowledge of how colleges and universities work and where the main challenges lie, which is one of the reasons why we're having this talk today. I think in the end, we as coaches affect not only how these organizations are run, but also how they educate their students. I haven't really talked much about students and talked more about the organizational things, because you as coaches are probably not going to be interacting much with students unless you're doing the pro bono. In a lot of career centers, for example, they have a lot of these programs. You may be engaging with students in that capacity. But, in a way, also, I think we can help those institutions become more of an example of what a modern people-centered workplace can be. And people-centered and also complexity-centered and diverse. When you look at all these different groups, diverse groups of stakeholders on these campuses, it's a tremendously diverse, tremendously colorful place. And working in that space, I think it's just really meaningful in trying to activate a lot of this diversity and the knowledge and wisdom that's contained therein. So, I'm an educator at heart. And I have found that working in higher ed as a coach is a really meaningful endeavor. And I hope that all of you who are listening, either live right now or maybe in a recording later on, now perhaps have a little better understanding of the tremendous impact or appreciation of the impact that we can have on the long-term well-being of institutions and the people who work there and who make it all happen. And we do all that through coaching and not through consulting, being there for our clients, supporting them where they are, and to create better futures for them. So that's all I have to say right now. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks a lot, Steve. It was super interesting. It was like a journey. So yeah, learning a lot of, especially for those of us who are not into that industry. So it was like a journey you took us into, and obviously it was interesting how to see how in which ways you see that coaching can help this sector, right? This knowledge sector. So I don't know if anyone has any question for Tim. Anyone has a comment that would like to share, please feel free to raise your hand or put it in the chat, and we will gladly bring it to Tim to see if he has anything that can support you with. Karen.
Hi, good morning. Thanks, Tim. Question for you. Is higher education the sole industry within which you coach, or is it just one sector that you focus on? Go ahead.
Yeah, I focus mostly on higher education because that's, when I got my training as a coach, I still worked in higher ed. And when I left, I wasn't sure where I was going to go with this. Of course, most coaching programs, they are more business coaching, executive coaching. But one of the things I discovered is that there's so many, as you know, there's so many coaches out there. Anybody could call themselves a coach, basically. And I figured, since I don't really have too strong a business background, I have a strong background in nonprofit, and I do a little bit of work in that space. But higher education is really where my heart beats. I am an educator at heart. And so that's mostly what I focus on, where I'm trying to build and grow also my practice, especially in the agile space. I didn't really address that very much. There's developed some frameworks for doing agile transformations in higher ed, especially on the administrative, non-academic side. It's tough to get in there because, a lot of times the people who have control over the money are not the people who see the need for these kind of services. Right? I talked about the folks on the front lines. They could really benefit from this kind of stuff, but they are not the ones who control the purse strings. So that's a little bit of a challenge there. But no, I am committed to really impacting higher ed because there's a lot of need there and tremendous potential.
Yeah, and if I may, sorry, Brendan, my follow-up question to that is, how are you getting in? I mean, I'm currently in higher ed and transitioning to coaching, so this is so like on target to where I am and to my path. In increasingly resource-constrained environments, how are you convincing institutions to invest their resources in this type of work?
So the way I'm currently doing it mostly is through coaching programs that are already established where there were RFPs out. I am a member of a couple of organizations where in one of them I'm actually a lead coach for a whole bench of higher ed coaches, and we have a contract with a big university. That is a great way to get in because already they have seen the need for coaching. There are more and more institutions where you can find RFPs. Now, a lot of these RFPs, they came out last fall. And as we all know, a lot of things have changed politically since then. So I'm not going to address that, but I mean, I'll let you draw your own conclusions here. So yes, resources have definitely shifted. Some institutions actually continue to see the value because they have seen how quickly the environment changes. And they have seen how the way they've been doing things just doesn't allow them to keep up with the pace of change. So for that reason, they already have these programs. So that's a good way to get in. So being on a bench of an organization that already has a coaching agreement with an institution, for example, that's a good way. It takes a lot of networking and a lot of just having conversations. And, you know, we all fail. I recently had one that looked extremely promising that also would have allowed me to do some agile work. And in the end, I mean, I presented to the provost, I presented to the provost teams. In the end, they said, nah, it's not what we want. Like, okay, that's how it is, you know. I mean, that's part of the rejection. But it is tough to get in. But the best way is to seek out those institutions who already have the basic understanding and appreciation for the value of coaching. I don't know, Karen, if that answers your question, but that might be a something to pursue.
Thanks, Tim. We have Brendan now.
Yeah, Tim, great presentation, man. This is super insightful. As someone who's not in higher ed, this is really cool. And I agree with Lori's comments, that representation of the facade, the silo. This is brilliant. And thank you to you, Karen. I was actually going to ask that question as well, so I'm glad you asked that about entering. Where do you enter this? My question is, and not knowing anything about higher ed, it sounds a lot like what you're talking about is like a traditional kind of university setting. Is there like a fringe in higher or like an edge of where innovation is accepted in higher ed? Like where would be those entry points where it's like these types of universities, these types of, maybe they're not even universities or traditional institutions of higher education. Where is that edge where innovation is accepted and they would be more coachable?
It is. So I would say generally a lot of innovation naturally is happening, but on the program level. So curricular level. You have a lot of programs that they're embracing tremendously innovative, state-of-the-art, cutting-edge technology, teaching pedagogy, for example. So that's really where it's happening. Where it's not happening is at the organizational level, right? So individual departments, for example, may structurally be extremely traditional, but some of their faculty are doing amazing work working with students creating new programs. So that's where a lot of innovation is. But what I've also seen, sometimes you have faculty leaders who are skeptical of that. And they feel threatened sometimes by other faculty members who may be very successful with these kind of things and then actually push back. So again, we're talking about ego, competence, these kind of things, right? I can't really stress enough how important it is. I know we have a faculty member here, they may just say no, 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 but I think it is, I've seen this happen many times. So that's where a lot of this is happening. Now, some smaller institutions, some institutions that are really thinking forward and have realized that coaching, for example, is an extremely powerful development tool. Those who actually put those RFPs out and try to seek vendors and promote this and socialize these kind of services across their campus. These exist, and there are more and more of them. I have seen presidential initiatives where the new president has come in and they said, we need to change the way we do things. We need to change the way we develop people. We have way too much turnover. We need to keep people. We need to keep them where, especially those who have built institutional knowledge over time. So this stuff does happen. But even sometimes those presidents find themselves fighting against a very, very rigid structure. And again, when we talk about faculty governance, who are saying, well, no, that's not, we don't want to do that, right? Again, I don't want to bedevil anybody here or talk, speak poor of anybody. But those dynamics exist, and I think they're super important to recognize. But innovation happens, and we're still, I think, U.S. university, Canadian university is still the envy of the world in many ways, right? That's why still so many people want to come here despite some of the more recent obstacles. But again, the organizational structure, the people we're going to be serving, they might be in a little different situation. Brandon, does this answer your question?
Yes, thank you. Brilliant. Appreciate that.
Perfect. Lori.
Hey, Tim, good to see you again.
Hey, good to see you too.
I just for others, my name's Lori Kohler. I was a higher ed administrator for 25 years. Stepped out to do both consulting and coaching. And one of the things I'm seeing is that when you have a leader, whether it's a provost or a president, who has experienced coaching themselves, and has an appreciation for what it offers, what it is, and what it isn't, that is helping at least spur an openness. Often that openness, what I'm experiencing is for, members of their direct team, which, Tim, you referenced earlier. Yes, we think about this for the kind of the executive level, the senior administrative level. I'm also, though, seeing like some of the CUPPA HR reports that speak to what Tim talked about with the challenges of staff retention, succession planning, the impact of that in specific areas, that's driving, I think, some institutional leaders to start thinking like, we got to do something to keep people. And if they also see coaching as not punitive, then it's a really great way they can invest in their staffs. And the last thing I'll say, by the way, Tim, this was phenomenal, and grateful for that, is that I've had 2 engagements with vice presidents who want to provide coaching for all of their staff, at least for their management level, so kind of those middle managers, and just fiscal constraints is the hurdle. And so trying to do something that at least is not just a one-off, but a group series of trainings over a period of time, at least is creating some window there. But the resource constraints are real.
Thank you so much, Lori, and you're absolutely right. There's 2 things that came to mind. First of all, about the resources. One argument I've been trying to make, and I guess I maybe have to hone it a little bit, is when you think about, from an HR perspective, how much money you're spending on replacing people who've left, I think that puts the cost of coaching into perspective. Of course, the challenge is you can't promise that because somebody receives coaching that they're going to stay, but I think the probability is going to be higher. And the other one, this beautifully, I think, dovetails with what Karen asked earlier, and that's the question of how do you get in? Lori, you're absolutely right. Those who have experienced coaching, and most likely it was a very positive experience, are much more likely to continue it or to recommend it to others. So one thing that I have done a little bit as well is offer a little bit of pro bono. So if you know somebody who might have, let's say it's the dean or a new department chair, or even a faculty member, who might have some challenges at work, say, well, I'm giving you a couple hours of my time, and then see how you like it. And then see, there might be ways of maybe using some professional development funds, maybe at a reduced rate, however you want to do it. That sometimes works. Now, one thing I have also noticed, and some people might be screaming when they hear me say this, even in very cash-strapped institutions, because I was in the budget and financial arena there, I was shocked to see how much money there still is floating around. Not everywhere, but oftentimes there is. And so I think a little bit of creativity, they ought to be able to get to 10, 20 grand or whatever it costs make it available for some coaching. Again, this is a very controversial view, but maybe something to explore at some point.
Great questions, great questions. And I think that this is one of the things that we have created this series, Coaching in Education, because as coaches, we want to come up with solutions, with models, with approaches that can help these organizations and their members, right? So I encourage you to, if you can, join us on Friday. We will discuss some ideas, and we'd love to brainstorm with you all to see what is possible and how we can be resourceful, or how we can be eventually bring some ideas that we can bring eventually in different models, right? Either pro bono, other sample, other case study with organizations that are willing to go through that, and we can use that as a case study. One of the reasons of outreach is to build the sustainability of our profession, and this is why these initiatives, the purpose of these initiatives that we're trying to do. So as I put in the chat, so thank you, Jim. Tim, I'm gonna go back to you just a sec, just a few announcements. So the first one is a survey feedback that we have. I put the link on the chat. Here's the QR if you want to scan it. And we love the feedback because this will help us to create more content for you. As I said, this is the launch of this series. We hopefully will have more and more every month of these initiatives and these topics.